Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to, dig into your source material and pull out the key insights. Today we're doing something pretty unique, I think, a deep dive into ancient monastic rules, and specifically all about clothing. Seems simple, right? But you've given us these fascinating bits from a text called Nissaggiya too. It lays out some really specific guidelines. So our mission today is to unpack how these rules started, what they tell us about, well, the daily grind for these monks, and what it means to be really well informed about rules that seem kind of out there from our perspective.
Absolutely. It's really a window into the practical side of spiritual life back then. It shows how even things that seem minor, like clothing, could actually shape significant legal and community structures. What really stands out is just the sheer level of detail and the thinking behind why these specific rules existed.
Okay, right. Let's dive in then. The sources set the scene for us in a place called Savatthi at Jetavana. What was the initial spark, the problem that got this whole robe discussion going?
Yeah, so the picture painted is monks in Savatthi at Jetavana, and Pitika's place. They were going off on these long trips, Jena Padakarika, they call them. And before they left, well, they'd often leave their robes behind with other monks for safekeeping. Makes sense, right? But the issue, as Ananda noticed, and he pointed it out to the Buddha, was that the robes, just sitting there for ages, they got kinikani, basically moldy.
Moldy robes, okay.
Exactly, you can imagine.
So it wasn't just, oh dear, mold. This actually prompted a bigger response, didn't it? What did the Buddha do? What was the first actual rule that came out of this?
Right, yeah. It wasn't just about airing them out better. A formal rule came into place, and it was really fundamental, about a monk always having their basic clothing right there with them. The first version of the rule went something like this. If a monk, once his robe-making period is done, ticīvara, and the kaṭhina ceremony is over, upadasmikaine, is separated from his three robes, the ticīvara, for even just one night, Bhikkhu ticīvara avippavāsasammuti. Well, that's a Nissaggiya pācittiya offense.
Wow, okay, so separated for even one night. That sounds pretty strict. It wasn't just a suggestion then. Can you break down those terms? What exactly are the ticīvara, the three robes, and what does Nissaggiya pācittiya actually mean in terms of consequences?
Sure. So ticīvara refers to the monk's essential kit, basically. Three robes.
Yeah.
The sage, that's the heavier outer one, often folded. Then the uttarasauga, the upper robe.
Yeah.
And the antarasauga, the inner wrap, like a waistcloth. These were crucial. And Nissaggiya pācittiya, that's a specific type of offense in the monastic code. It means two things happen. First, the item involved the robe, in this case has to be forfeited, given up to the community. And second, the monk has to formally confess the offense. So it really shows how seriously they took this idea of personal responsibility for even these basic items. It wasn't trivial.
Yeah, forfeiture and confession, that definitely sends a message. But like you often see, rules hit reality, right? The sources then give us this great example, a kind of aha moment. The story of a sick monk down in Kosambi. Apparently, he was too ill to actually carry his robes around, and his family invited him to stay, but he was worried because of this new rule, what was going through his mind.
Exactly. You could just picture him, can't you? He's sick, he probably feels terrible, can't manage his stuff, but he knows this rule. Don't be separated from your robes, even for a night. He's stuck. Does he follow the rule strictly, or does he accept the help he clearly needs from his relatives? It's that classic tension. In this specific case, this very human situation, is what led to the rule being, well, adjusted. It shows they weren't completely inflexible. There was room for compassion.
So how did they handle it? Did the Buddha just say, okay, sick monks are exempt, or was it more specific?
It was more specific. He allowed for something called an avippavāsasammuti. That's basically a formal permission granted by the community, specifically for a sick monk, allowing them to be separated from the robes. So it wasn't a free-for-all, if you feel a bit unwell. It was a defined exception for a legitimate reason, granted through a process.
A process, right. And the sources say that process was really quite formal, almost like a little ceremony. How did a monk get this permission?
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't casual. The sick monk had to go before the Sangha, the community of monks. He had to bow down, then squat, put his hands together in the Anjali gesture, that respectful gesture of prayer or greeting. And then he had to formally ask for this permission, this avippavāsasammuti, in 3 separate times.
3 times, okay.
Yes. And then it wasn't automatic. A designated monk, someone deemed competent, would then formally propose the request to the whole Sangha. They would then collectively grant the permission. It really highlights how communal everything was. Even exceptions weren't just individual decisions. They were community sanctioned. Transparency was key.
That's fascinating. So the rule needed to be strict, but they built in this very structured way to handle genuine human needs. How did they actually change the wording of the rule to include this?
They added a crucial little phrase. The revised rule read, if a monk remains separated from his 3 robes for even 1 night, except the permission of the monks, anyatra bhikkhu sammuti, it is a Nissaggiya pācittiya offense. That, except with the permission of the monks, that's the key. It acknowledges the general rule, but carves out that specific community-improved exception for illness. It's a neat balance, really. Discipline and compassion.
Right. So the core issue is being separated, but that itself sounds like it could be open to interpretation. Did they define exactly what separated meant? Like, how close did you have to be?
They absolutely did. This is where it gets incredibly detailed. They introduced this concept of upakara. It means something like a precinct or a range or vicinity. And they made distinctions. Was it an ekopakaro, a single unified area? Or nanopakaro, multiple separate areas? The rules hinged on this. The basic idea was you had to stay within a certain defined zone relative to your robes, and that zone changed depending on where you were.
Okay, upakara. Precinct or range. So it wasn't just a vague, keep them nearby. Give us some examples. How did this work in, say, a village?
Okay, so take a village, a gamo. If it was enclosed, like walled or fenced, and it was considered single-family occupancy, maybe one extended family, then if your robe was inside the village enclosure, you were okay as long as you also stayed inside that enclosure.
Simple enough.
But if the village was unenclosed, or if you stepped outside the enclosure, then the rule tightened right up. You had to be within hatapasa of the robe.
Hatapasa? What's that?
Literally hands reach. Close enough to touch it or grab it easily.
Oh, okay. Hands reach. That's specific.
Very. And if the village was enclosed but multifamily, then if your robe was in a particular house, you had to stay in that house or right by its door, or, again, within hand's reach if you were outside that specific house, but still within the village.
Okay, I'm starting to see the pattern. Enclosed spaces give you a bit more leeway. Open spaces mean hand's reach.
Yep.
What about other places, like buildings or monasteries?
Similar logic. For a dwelling, nivisana, a walled city, udosito, a tower, atio, an upper floor malo, a palace, pasado, a mansion, amiya, even a park, a ramo, or a monastery, biharo, the rules followed that same kind of pattern. Was it enclosed, single occupancy, or multiple? That determined if you needed to be within the specific structure or just within the overall boundary or right down to that hand's reach proximity.
Incredible. They really tried to cover every possible place a monk might be. What about traveling, like on a boat?
Yep, they covered that too. A boat, nava. If it was a single-family boat, maybe just the monk traveling with a supporter, robe inside, monk stays inside, easy.
Yeah.
But if it's a multi-family boat, like a ferry perhaps, then the monk had to stay within their specific compartment or section of the boat, or, you guessed it,
Within hand's reach.
within hatapasa, exactly.
And a caravan, traveling overland with a group.
A caravan, sato. If it was considered single-family, maybe a monk traveling with a specific group of patrons, the robes in the caravan, and the monk had to stay within satavantara. Satabantara. It means within 7 cubits.
Yeah.
So roughly 10 or 12 feet, either in front of or behind the caravan boundary, or close enough to keep it in sight.
7 cubits. Okay, slightly more room than hand's reach, but still pretty close for a moving caravan.
Right. But if it was a multifamily caravan, lots of different people traveling together, it'd snap back to the stricter rule. Hatapasa, hands reach.
It's like this constant calculation monks had to be doing. Field, threshing floor, under a tree. The text just keeps going, right?
It really does. Fields, threshing floors, the nyakatikya, same logic about enclosure and hands reach as villages. Under a tree root, hukamula, the precinct was defined by the shade the tree cast at midday.
You're kidding. The midday shade.
That's what it says. And out in the open air, arjokaso, like a forest with no village nearby, a radius of satabantara, 7 cubits all around the robe, was considered one precinct. Step beyond that, and you were considered separated.
Wow. The level of detail is just staggering. It really paints a picture of constant mindfulness about your belongings, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It shows this incredible commitment to precision, in discipline, in managing property, even something as basic as clothing. It was about order, accountability, and maybe minimizing disputes or carelessness within the community.
So it wasn't just where the robe was, but also your state of mind about it. The text gets into levels of offense based on awareness, right?
That's right. It's quite sophisticated, actually. To commit the full Nissaggiya pācittiya offense, the one requiring forfeiture and confession, several conditions usually had to be met. You had to actually be separated from the robes, obviously. But also, you had to be either aware that you were separated and didn't have permission, or you were doubtful about whether you were separated and didn't have permission, or even if you were totally unaware you were separated but
Right.
still didn't have
Okay.
permission.
So even being unaware wasn't necessarily an excuse.
Not for the main offense, no. It also applied if various other conditions were met, like you hadn't managed to get the robe back before dawn, you hadn't formally relinquished it if you should have, it wasn't genuinely lost or destroyed or stolen without your fault, and so on.
Okay. Were there lesser offenses then? Situations where maybe you made a mistake but didn't lose your robe over it?
Yes. There's a category called dukkaya, which is generally translated as a minor offense or wrongdoing.
Hmm.
You could get a dukkaya, for example, if you actually used a robe that should have been forfeited, a Nissaggiya robe, before you'd actually gone through the process of relinquishing it. That makes sense.
Using confiscated goods, essentially.
Sort of, yeah. But interestingly, you could also get a dukkaya offense if you were not actually separated from your robes, but you thought you were separated. Or if you were not separated, but you were doubtful about it.
Ah, so that's about your state of mind, your perception, even if reality was different. The sort of mental error.
Exactly. It acknowledges that intention or mistaken belief still matters, just at a lower level than the actual act of improper separation.
Okay, that adds another layer. So we have the main offense, the minor offense. Were there times when there was simply no offense? And anpari.
Yes, absolutely. There were clear exemptions. Anabhati, no offense, occurred if the monk realized their mistake and managed to retrieve the robe, or formally relinquish it if needed, before sunrise the next day. A kind of grace period.
Okay, a chance to fix it.
Right. Also, no offense if the robe was genuinely lost, destroyed, burned up, or stolen things outside the monk's immediate control, or was given away properly. And of course, no offense if the monk had the Saga's permission, that avippavāsasammuti we talked about for illness.
Makes sense.
Also, interestingly, no offense for someone considered insane, a madakasa, as they weren't deemed fully responsible for their actions. And finally, a really important one. No offense for the adhikamikasa, the person committing the act for the very first time. It suggests a learning curve was expected. You get one free pass, so to speak, while you learn the ropes.
That first-timer exemption is quite telling, isn't it? Allows for education within the system. Gosh, this whole deep dive, it just reveals this incredible, almost microscopic attention to detail in these rules. Starting from, a practical problem like moldy robes and ending up with rules specifying hands reach, 7 cubits, midday shadows. It's clear they thought about regulating almost every moment for the sake of community harmony. It's really quite something.
It really is. And it does make you think, doesn't it? What can we take away from this kind of rigorous, detailed approach to rules? Especially today when sometimes we feel overwhelmed with information, maybe rules get vague or we resist adapting them. How do you find that balance between having clear, precise guidelines, which obviously served a purpose here, and also having the compassion and flexibility to deal with real life, like they did with the sick monk?
Absolutely. That sick monk example is key, I think. It shows the system wasn't totally rigid. Necessity, real human situations, forced an evolution in the rule. It created something that aimed to be both strict and practical, which really gets you thinking about rules in general, doesn't it? How they need to be living things, constantly interacting with our actual experiences. How do we build that kind of thoughtful flexibility, that balance between the ideal and the real, into the systems and rules we rely on in our own complicated world today? Something to ponder.